All right, welcome back. I was recently conversing with some of our followers, and I had a gentleman reach out and ask if we would talk a little bit more about ADHD and talk about the impacts of ADHD on marriage and on relationships in general, and maybe some tips or tricks on how to navigate ADHD in a way that can be less difficult for a relationship, more pro-connection in a relationship. So that's what our video is going to be about today. We're going to talk about 4 ways that ADHD can negatively impact relationships and what we can do in a relationship where you or your partner has ADHD to help promote a more positive relational experience. So stay tuned. Okay, so let's get started on this topic. What is ADHD? Let's begin there. ADHD stands for Attention-Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, right? So Attention-Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. And when you break down kind of what is ADHD and how does it manifest itself, a lot of that is explained in the title. So attention deficit just means a difficult time attending, holding attention on one thing. The attention wants to kind of scatter and get preoccupied and distracted, right? So attention deficit, a deficit in the ability to hold attention. And then hyperactivity disorder. So hyperactivity just means that I'm a little bit more active, a little bit more prone to being active, to movement, to wanting to change spaces, getting distractible kind of physically, restless. That can be a really common sign and symptom that goes with ADHD as well. There isn't always the hyperactive component, and there isn't necessarily always the attention deficit component, right? That there's a mixture of both of these in various levels of strength that can cause a person some difficulty in navigating life, in navigating career, and navigating relationships, right? In navigating schooling and education. Can cause an individual some difficulty when they have multiple of these symptoms of deficits in the attention and in the hyperactivity, this kind of being prone to being super hyperactive or super restless. So I want to talk about that specifically today as it relates to relationship. So jumping into this then, Attention-Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that's used by psychiatrists, psychologists, clinical mental health counselors, marriage and family therapists, really anybody who's dealing with mental health disorders, it defines ADHD like this: a persistent pattern of inattention and or hyperactivity and impulsivity that interferes with functioning or development. So it's got to be interfering enough in a person's daily life that it's causing them significant troubles. You'll notice as we go into some of the patterns of ADHD that many of us exhibit these patterns. They're quite common in a lot of our lives, but just like any mental health condition, it's when those patterns of behavior become pervasive enough and persistent enough, right? They exist enough and on a high enough level in a person's world that they kind of meet what's called a clinical cutoff, which just means that they've reached a point at which they're becoming now a diagnosable problem in a person's world. They're interfering enough that they're classifiably a mental health problem versus just symptoms that many of us might naturally feel. And here's some of the symptoms that it includes when you kind of break down ADHD diagnostically. First is this inattention dynamic. And the second is this hyperactivity and impulsivity component. But we're going to begin with the inattention component. So struggles to give attention to detail, has a hard time sustaining attention, especially longer term periods of time, focusing on a particular thing for sustained periods of time, seems to not listen when spoken to directly, often fails to follow through on tasks or assignments or projects, can get started, a really good start on those, but then have a hard time seeing them through to the end. Difficulty organizing tasks and then keeping those tasks organized as they go along. Frequently avoids and dislikes tasks that require sustained attention. Often loses important and necessary things in their lives. So keys, purses, wallets, right? Like things like that in their world that are important for them to hold on to. Can be difficult for them to keep track of. easily distracted by outside stimuli. Can be sitting in a meeting or having a conversation between partners. And if there's people talking outside of the room, sometimes their mind will wander to that instead of focused on what's right in front of them. And forgetful in daily activities, right? So can go through their daily life and kind of forget and be kind of disoriented, disorganized as they go through their day. Can get easily flustered that way. So these are some of the really common inattentive aspects of ADHD. And typically the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual says if you're qualifying for around 6 of those, that can be a high probability that this person might be struggling with an inattentive type of ADHD. So let's look at the hyperactivity part then, the impulse control aspect. Let's flip to that now. So fidgets, taps hands or feet or squirms, this type of like constant moving, even when you're sitting still, can be a sign or symptom of ADHD. Leaves seat in situations when remaining seated is expected, that oftentimes in meetings or things, this person will want to get up and pace back and forth in the back of the room, might want to exit the room several times, bathroom, drink, checking a phone or a computer or something. So a hard time kind of sitting still long periods of time. Often feels restless with urges to move. So we kind of talked about that in that previous one. Just wanting to be doing something all the time. It can be hard to sit still and focus. Unable to take part in leisure activities quietly, right? So leisure activities are often very enjoyable for somebody with ADHD, but they're often quite loud or expressive in those, and versus kind of quietly to the side doing that activity. Often on the go. So wanting to move and wanting to be working on the next thing, sometimes not even finishing the first thing before I move to the next thing. Talks excessively, blurts out answers before questions are finished, or completes people's sentences. So all of this kind of anxious effort to kind of move the conversation along quickly, or maybe getting to a part that they're most focused on in the conversation. Often has trouble waiting his or her turn in conversations or in lines or in projects or whatever it may be, and then interrupts or intrudes on others, sometimes just kind of barges in to circumstances without kind of thinking or tracking how that's being received. So that's some of the hyperactive kind of impulse sides of ADHD. And again, the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, says about 6 of those. If you're hitting 6 of those criteria, that there's a good chance that you might be dealing with some ADHD. So that's kind of a good definition of what is ADHD and how does it impact the lives of individuals who are struggling with some ADHD. And specifically to this video, we want to talk a little bit about 4 ways that it can negatively impact relationships. Now, I want to caveat, ADHD doesn't have to destroy relationships. In fact, there's lots of happy couples out there who one or both partners have ADHD. So it's not inherently evil or bad or destructive to relationships. We just need to know a little bit about ADHD and how it works in order to manage the relationship in a way that can be healthy and functioning, right? So that's what we're focused on today. I don't want you to feel like if you have ADHD or you're dating somebody or married to somebody who has ADHD, that your relationship's going to be doomed. That's not the case at all. What we do want to talk about is ways that you can manage the ADHD and manage expectations around it in order to help your relationship thrive. So here's some 4 things that I've come up with in working with people who have ADHD, who are navigating their relationship and want to do it in the healthiest manner. And the first one is that ADHD can negatively impact the relationship because it can hurt emotional intimacy. So if you're not careful, right, with that list that we just went through, the inattentive and hyperactive components of ADHD can really hurt the emotional intimacy in a relationship. Emotional intimacy is often built between 2 people who are sharing on a deep and vulnerable level about their life experiences. They're exchanging those with each other. And in order to do that in a way that's really powerful and potent, we want to be listening for understanding often in the relationship, which is a really kind of attentive and engaged type of listening that sometimes is missing with ADHD. ADHD can sometimes have a hard time doing that attending and that engagement in the conversation, especially if it's a longer conversation, right? They might want to get distracted, or they might move on to a different topic, or might have a hard time sitting still long enough for that conversation to really gain some depth. So being mindful about that, right? Being attentive to that in your relationship, right? How can I set aside some time where I really practice focusing on my partner and attending to them on a deeper level than I might typically do? We talk about this a lot in our Maintaining Intimacy and Sex video course, especially the part 1 in that video course. I'll stick that right here. But in the Maintaining Intimacy and Sex, we talk a lot about this idea of building emotional intimacy. And I go into a little bit more tips and tricks and strategies for doing that emotional intimacy work in a relationship. But if you're dealing with somebody who has ADHD, it can be helpful to be aware, right, that they're not trying to be distracted, and their level of attention doesn't necessarily match their level of commitment or love for you. It's just attending to conversations, being focused in conversations, and listening in engaged ways, and listening for understanding can sometimes be painful and difficult and hard for that individual. So cut them a little bit of slack if you're dealing with somebody that way, realizing that they don't mean to get distracted. And if you are the person with ADHD, we really want to focus on how can I do this a little bit better, right? How can I intentionally practice making sure that my partner gets some focused time? A second way that ADHD can hurt close relationships if left unchecked is that they can negatively impact reliability. Now, you'll notice in that list that we were talking about earlier that a lot of this has to do with being disorganized and distracted, right? That you might send the person to the store to get a certain number of things, they don't come back with them, or you might have expectations in the relationship that divides responsibilities, and they might be dropping the ball on some of those responsibilities. And I was working with a couple recently whose husband has ADHD, and they were really struggling as a couple because the wife was getting really frustrated that he would keep losing jobs, right? So this disorganized thing was creating issues even at work, that about every 6 months he was turning over his employment because his bosses would finally get to this place where they were frustrated with the job. And she didn't understand what was going on. In a lot of ways, he didn't really understand the impacts of ADHD either. And so she just felt like that he would just get bored. And because he wasn't committed in the relationship, he would just let his job burn down. And that was really hard on her financially to feel reliability. So we want to be cautious about that. We want to be careful that it can erode at the feelings of reliability and consistency in the relationship that are really important for a relationship to remain strong. A third way that ADHD can negatively impact relationships is it can breed criticism and defensiveness. Now you'll notice as I went through those lists of inattentive and hyperactive components of ADHD earlier, that it could get really frustrating or irritating sometimes to be in a relationship with somebody with ADHD, or to be the person in the relationship with ADHD, right? There creates a lot of these kind of imperfection moments. They could be criticized, and that criticism could kind of build defensiveness in the relationship, really become a conflict between two partners because of the nature of some of the symptoms of ADHD. So we want to be careful about that, right? That as we start to realize issues that are happening in the relationship, that we speak more about those from a place of I feel type statements, that we're talking with each other about the problem and we're letting the problems be the problem instead of making the people in the relationship the problem, right? That we can use responsible language about the experiences we're having in the relationship and then try to be open to that, right? That my partner's only giving me this feedback because they love me and they want to be close to me and they want to be connected to me. And the things that we're talking about in the relationship are things that are getting in the way of us being connected. That's why it matters to them to share with me, so that I'm not so quick to become defensive to things that feel critical, right? That open communication without criticism, without defensiveness can go a real long way in helping a couple who's dealing with some ADHD bridge the gaps in their relationship. You can learn more about some of those communication strategies if you take a look at our whole video course. It focuses on conflict resolution and repair strategies. Also, our advanced communication strategies video course. It's also very helpful in helping kind of walk you through communication strategies to work during difficult times in your relationship. And finally, number 4 ADHD can make an individual prone to losing interest in a relationship or becoming distracted in that relationship or even creating intensity in the relationship quite frequently. And that can be hard on any relationship, right? You might find yourself, sometimes we talk about people who are serial daters, right? That they're constantly wanting to meet new people, almost like they get bored too quickly in order to really have longevity in a relationship, right? They get in the relationship in the beginning, they're intrigued and they're in discovery mode of trying to figure out who is this person and how do I win their love? And as they're in that relationship for a little while, it becomes easy for them to kind of feel burned out and wanting to move on to the next one, kind of that antsy feeling in the relationship. Or another individual may struggle with the distractibility, right? That they have a hard time really focusing on the relationship because there's so many other things in their life, other projects, other hobbies, other interests, other people that constantly pull their mind away from their partner. And as a result of that, they're in a relationship, but they're just not attending to it very often. And then finally, this intensity one, right? Sometimes somebody with ADHD, they need a lot of stimulus. And so sometimes if the stimulus isn't high enough in the relationship, fun, excitement, intrigue, right? Like those types of things going on, they'll create some, right? Sometimes they can kind of stir things up in the relationship, which can be helpful, right? That can be exciting and engaging for a partner. Or it can be really destructive, right? They might be creating drama just to have some sort of stimulus going on in the relationship, which isn't fun. And if you're with an introvert and you have ADHD, sometimes that can be like stimulus overload for your partner, right? That you can go so much that sometimes the partner can kind of be like, whoa, chill out. It can be a lot to handle sometimes because of this dynamic. So these are 4 things, right? Hurts the emotional intimacy, negatively impacts reliability, sometimes can breed criticism and defensiveness in the relationship, and then certainly can be prone to a loss of interest, distractibility, or intensity. These are 4 ways we want to keep in mind that ADHD potentially could have a negative impact on the relationship. So let's talk real quick then about some tips. What are some tips for how we can help safeguard the relationship from negative impacts of ADHD and even thrive as a couple in spite of ADHD being part of our relationship? The first tip is to learn more about ADHD and understand how it impacts your relationship. So if you're the person who struggles with some ADHD and you haven't yet, go talk with your doctor. If you're relating to some of the symptoms that I've listed here in this video, go talk with your doctor, your primary physician. You can get connected with a mental health counselor, a psychologist, a psychiatrist. Let's get that diagnosed for sure and understand really what we're dealing with and be responsible about learning and growing a little bit more in your knowledge of ADHD. And if it's your partner who's struggling with it, learn a little bit more about it. Read some books about it, right? Talk with a primary care physician as well. I've found that the more educated an individual is on symptoms that they're experiencing or that their partner is experiencing in a relationship, the more empathy and compassion they can have for that thing over time. The second one is to seek help to manage symptoms of ADHD. You can do this through self-help outlets, through medication, through talking to a mental health professional, right? But let's learn some strategies and some skills to govern and manage the symptoms. If left unchecked, these symptoms can not only hurt relationships, but they can hurt your ability to thrive in a lot of areas of your life. We talked about earlier the gentleman who was really struggling at work, or the student that's really struggling in their graduate program, right? Or the individual who's really struggling in their friendships to keep people close to them and connected to them. So if left unchecked, they can really be difficult to manage, and they can really become depressing and frustrating as an individual who's suffering with them and become problematic for the people that you're trying to connect to. So there's a lot that can be done in gaining skills and resources and start with some self-help, look into some medication, talk with a therapist. Let's jump on top of those and manage those in a way that they have less negative impact in your world. The final tip is to set goals for growth and do that one day at a time, beginning with the most meaningful areas for you and for your partner, right? So this daily setting of goals can be really helpful, especially short-term goals, because we're dealing with ADHD, and ADHD sometimes has a hard time with real long-term goals. So if you just break it down in the relationship to say, okay, I'm struggling in 4 or 5 different areas in this relationship because of some of the ADHD that I'm experiencing. What's one area that I know that I would like to improve, right? Let's say it's attention to detail, right? So I'm going to work this week on being more focused on the details. As I interact with my partner and as I go about my day, I'm going to focus in on the details, right? What's the detail? That's going to be my mantra this week. And I'm going to practice that as I go through the week in all the aspects of my life, right? So breaking that down and looking for what's something that would be helpful to me and to my partner, and how can I work on that short-term goal? Hyper-focus in on that goal, and then as I get a little bit better at it, expanding into a new one. That's a really great way to deal with ADHD. Sometimes in counseling, we call that chunking, right? So really breaking out a piece that'll help me improve over time and hyper-focusing on that for a short period of time. And if it's your partner that's struggling with ADHD, right, like talking with them about one area that you would like them to focus on and improve. And be okay if you have to remind them frequently about that, right? That doesn't mean that they don't love you enough to remember or they don't love you enough to be organized, right? We talked about earlier that organization or that attention to detail can be hard. So trying to depersonalize that a little bit and letting them know, here's an area that would be great to work on. Here's how you could do it successfully with me. And then be willing to remind them, encourage them, coach them, right? Cheerlead them as they go to try to enrich that aspect in the relationship. So those are 3 tips to learn more about the ADHD, understand how it impacts you, how it impacts the relationship. That knowledge can be power sometimes. Seek help to manage the symptoms, whether that's through self-help, medication, therapeutic intervention, whatever it may be. Let's take responsible steps to improving and managing the symptoms. And then finally, setting goals for growth. Let's focus one day at a time and beginning with the most important things to me as I think about ways I'd like to grow and the most important ways that my spouse would appreciate me growing, my partner, right? Let's hone in on those first and setting those goals and then one goal at a time, hyper-focused on that for a week or so at a time, right? As I get a little bit better at that, then the next week I'm going to switch it up and do something different. And sometimes we can play to the strengths of ADHD as we approach goals in that way. I hope this has been helpful to you. In the comments below, list the tip that you resonate with the most, right? So tell us a little bit about what is that component that you can really relate to and that you plan to implement or that you plan to encourage your partner to implement to help your relationship be a little bit better. If there's any other topics that you're interested in that you would love for us to focus on here at Renew Relationship Counseling, leave that in the comments below. We're always happy to cater our content to the things that'll help couples thrive the most. So take care for now, and I look forward to being with you again soon.